So the board will open the public hearing on this topic at 5:56 p.m. Paul?
Thank you very much. And I believe you'll be forwarding the slides for me.
Yes, I will.
Great. First off, thanks for having us here today. My name is Paul Mitchell. I'm the owner of a firm called Redistricting Partners. We're a firm that works primarily here in California around redistricting and CVRA conversion and analysis of voting rights issues and so on. We've done over 100 redistrictings and CVRA conversions in just this state. We also are the demographer for the state of New York in their statewide and New York City redistricting. We're working in Portland as well and other places around the country. We've done work. And we are also unique among redistricting firms that we also work with the research community and universities and with Common Cause and ACLU and other groups in trying to advocate for redistricting reform to try to make redistricting more fair and public oriented and less backroom and political. So we're really happy to be a part of your process. We've done a lot of redistricting in this area as well, in this county with cities and other agencies all around here. So happy to be here. We'll just go through these slides real quick to go over what redistricting is, what the California Voting Rights Act is, and I'm happy to take any questions. The things we'll cover are the California Voting Rights Act, kind of a what is districting. You'll find that I talk about this process as redistricting, even though technically it is a first districting. There's no re in it, but it's just that that's kind of the common terminology. I'll talk about the Voting Rights Act. There's the California Voting Rights Act and then the Federal Voting Rights Act. And California Voting Rights Act is really kind of a misnomer. It's mostly about conversion to district election system that doesn't take on the large scope of voting rights issues that the Federal Voting Rights Act does. We'll talk about traditional redistricting principles and how redistricting works or should work. And then we're just going to dive in for a moment to talk about the population data and talk about your upcoming hearings. So if we can go to the next slide. So the California Voting Rights Act is a state-based law. Like I said, it doesn't cover the vast number of issues that are covered by the Federal Voting Rights Act, everything from how ballots are printed to where precincts go to how registration is done. The California Voting Rights Act is narrowly tailored to looking at whether or not elections in at-large systems, which is a system that elects multiple representatives from the larger agency, is allowed or not. And it bases that kind of test of whether or not it should be allowed on whether or not that agency has underneath it racially polarized voting. And those are kind of, there's a lot of definitions around what is at large and also what is racially polarized voting. At the core, racially polarized voting is voting patterns that can be identified based on racial composition of a precinct, where if somebody were to come in here, they could literally, you could give them two candidates and give them the ethnic composition of those candidates or which, candidates are in a race, and then tell them the ethnic composition of every precinct. And they could write a formula that describes the likely election outcome based on race. And in areas where you have that kind of voting pattern, you're not allowed anymore in California to have at-large elections. And we've seen these cases come forward all throughout the county here and all throughout the state. And, it's our expectation that if you did do that kind of research, you would find, and we've done it in this area before, that there is racially polarized voting. So if we go to the next slide. The key difference between the Federal Voting Rights Act and the State Voting Rights Act is the Federal Voting Rights Act can also require you to go from at-large election systems to districted election systems, but there are higher tests. You have to be able to create majority and minority districts. And you have to be able to prove that the conversion to an election system will relieve a harm, that it'll actually create a different outcome. The California Voting Rights Act is neutral on that. You don't have to create majority and minority districts to be required to go to a districted system under the California Voting Rights Act. And there doesn't have to be some test or measure to say at the end of the day, it's going to create differences in the election system. It's just, do you have racially polarized voting? Oh, you do? Then convert. There is a case coming out of Santa Monica that was potentially going to be heard this June, but the Supreme Court didn't take it on, so they might hear it in September. That would look at that question of what is the harm we're trying to get relief for, and what is the expectation of, do they have to be majority minority or something like that? But that case is, potentially even a year or more still out. We go to the next slide. The one thing the California Voting Rights Act got amended to do in the last decade was make it easier for you to convert. It used to be that if you said, we want to do the right thing and we want to convert to the district election system, the state law didn't provide a pathway for you to do that yourselves. You literally had to say, we're going to convert, and then we're going to spend $1 million on an election to get the voters to affirm our decision to convert the election system. It was really tough for a lot of agencies that wanted to convert. So first with the community colleges, we got a bill done to make it easier for them to convert through a waiver process. And now schools, special districts, cities, everybody can convert as long as they follow a set process. And so we'll talk about that set process, but that's generally called the safe harbor provisions. Next slide. So it's important to talk about what this is going to do, what it's not going to do. Districting is going to set up the boundaries for your elections. What it's not going to do is determine what kids go to what schools. It's not going to determine what schools you're supposed to care about or what neighborhoods you're supposed to care about. You still can act in the interest of the district at large, but on election day, you'll be running for office just within that district and not be receiving votes from the rest of the agency. So it determines eligibility and voting. What it doesn't determine is how you have to act as a board. If we go to the next slide. And then I already said that, so we can go to the next slide. So Federal Voting Rights Act, it goes into there's two main provisions of the Federal Voting Rights Act. Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act is the idea of majority minority districts. And there are tests, the Jingles tests, that look at how racially polarized voting might exist and how it would affect the requirement to go to majority minority districts. And then there's also something called Section 5 of the Federal Voting Rights Act that has to do with getting the federal government to sign off on your plan for redistricting. Section 5 will come up sometimes, but it was basically dismantled by the Supreme Court. And Section 5 didn't affect San Mateo County anyway, so it wouldn't have affected you even if there was Section 5. It affected Monterey County, affected Merced and Kings and Kern and Yuba, but it didn't affect San Mateo. We go to the next slide. So to dive in a little bit more in case this comes up about the Federal Voting Rights Act. The Federal Voting Rights Act requires majority minority districts in certain cases. Doesn't require them all the time. But if a minority population is sufficiently large enough and concentrated enough that you can, using like a normal looking district, not like a district that looks like, an octopus doing yoga, just like a normal looking district where 50% or more of the minority population can be put into one district, then that's the first test. Can you actually do it? The second test is, does that population in that area vote as a block? Do they generally vote in concert with each other based on ethnic concerns or ethnic considerations? And then finally, is there a block of voters that is stopping them from electing their candidate of choice? Are they always trying to vote for this candidate, but then the white population is coming in and trumping that vote and voting for another candidate? So that's the idea that under Federal Voting Rights Act, if you do have a Section 2 district is what it's called, then that means that you have a district you can draw with reasonable redistricting principles and you have racially polarized voting. If that comes up, we might seek legal counsel or get some interpretation if there are concerns about it. But, generally in this area, we have seen Asian majority minority districts, and we can look and see if that's possible. And then in other parts of this region, you have had places where you could draw Latino majority minority districts, but I don't think you necessarily find that here. We go to the next slide. So when we draw districts, we are, under the California Voting Rights Act, supposed to look at the criteria in the Fair Maps Act. These are really kind of like good redistricting principles anyway. But the way we're going to draw districts in this area is to first draw districts that are equally sized. Now, when I say that, I mean equal-ish. There's a buffer of roughly 10%. If we go to the next slide, I think there's a little screen that shows it. So if two areas are within, you know, a small number within each other, you know, there's a 10% range essentially from the highest to the lowest district, and they're close enough, that would be considered equal. And you're going to hear a term called deviation. Deviation is how far away a district is from being perfectly sized, if all districts were equally sized perfectly. There's also another term for, they use the same word, deviation. Deviation can also mean the overall plan. How much all the districts are away from each other or from their median. And the way we calculate that is by looking at the district that's the most overpopulated and looking at the district that's the most underpopulated. And if the most overpopulated district is 4% over and the most underpopulated is 4% under, the sum of that, or the absolute value, the sum of the absolute value is 8. So that's an 8% deviation. If it's 2 over, 2 under, that's 4. Our goal is to stay under 10. That doesn't only mean 5 up, 5 down. It could mean that the largest overpopulated is 8 over and the most underpopulated is 2 under, and you could still have that 10% total plan deviation. We're going to draw districts that are contiguous, which is going to mean that they don't hop or jump. Now, contiguous can mean 2 things. Like a lot of stuff in redistricting, you get in these definition issues. Contiguous can mean like I'm soaring above the area and I can see that it's all one shape without having like separate parts. But contiguous can also mean something is functionally contiguous. If I'm hovering above something and it's a whole thing, but through the middle of it is a river and a train track and a mountain, these 2 populations on either side aren't actually functionally contiguous. You can't like get from one to the other without going out of the district and back in. So we're going to look at contiguity within the plans, not just about whether or not they are literally contiguous shapes, but also like, do they actually connect? If we go to the next slide. This shows the idea of something like literally being not contiguous, but it's also about how things function and whether they're functional. So next slide. Here's an idea of contiguity. In this map, which was an actual redistricting plan that an agency tried to adopt, you have this purple district. It's not contiguous. It has separate disconnected parts that don't meet up with each other. It might have made sense to the agency like, oh, well, this is all north of this one street, so we're going to put them all in the same district. But from a redistricting perspective in the current state law, that wouldn't be a legal district, that purple district. We go to the next slide. This is a district where we have 4 really compact districts at the top. Davis, we did this one. 4 districts that are really compact at the top, and you have this long, weird district at the bottom. And you think to yourself, well, why didn't you just draw 5 districts that are all kind of, you know, columns next to each other? Well, the problem is that that highlighted line is train tracks. And you can't cross the train tracks without getting or going around and outside the districts if you had 5 columns. So we ended up creating 1 district underneath these train tracks and then 4 above it. So the idea, this is actually a compact and contiguous district, but it is shaped by that geographic boundary. Next slide. So the other thing we're going to look at is maintaining communities of interest. Now, this is pretty subjective criteria. Let's see the next slide if I have a thing. Yeah. So there are Voting Rights Act protected communities of interest like Black and Latino and Asian or language minorities or other groups that could be considered a community of interest in a Section 2 Federal Voting Rights Act criteria. But what we're really going to look for is communities of interest based on a couple things, or three things actually. Is this a community that you can name? It's the cycling community, it's the senior community, it's the community of where there are more students, or there's a community that's more of a hillside community. What is it? It is a thing, okay? Is it something that is geographically defined? If you said, oh, I've got a community of interest, left-handers, because they're always fighting for the armrest and they need the silly can openers that are the other way. That's not a real community of interest in a redistricting perspective because they're not segregated to one part of town. They live everywhere. They're amongst us. So you want to have identifiable, you want to have geographically, hopefully compact, like that they're actually more concentrated in one area than the other. And then the final one is that they relate to you and your governance and what you're doing as an agency. You might say, hey, Paul, there was a water district redistricting and there was this hillside community and that's a community of interest. But then we look and it's because in the water district, they pay a higher rate because they're on a hillside. And so they're a community of interest in the water district because they have a specific issue, but they might not be a community of interest in a school district redistricting. So we want to see things that have that connection to your policies. Let's go to the next slide. And we can go to the next slide. So this is the idea, the three things: group with shared culture, geographic nature, and a relationship to the agency and the policies. Next slide. Following easily understandable lines, this is kind of the part of redistricting where you say, oh, that makes sense to me. That looks like a district. And so you want to have things following and relying on natural or man-made boundaries or freeways or geographic boundaries based on where cities are or other kinds of administrative lines. Next slide. Keeping districts compact. And compactness, I could give an hour-long speech about the different mathematical formulas for compactness. There's one formula of compactness of just putting a rubber band around it and measuring the rubber band around it relative to the external boundaries of the actual district lines. There's in New Mexico, I think it was, you're not allowed to have silly looking districts. But in California, we use a measure for compactness that you don't bypass nearby populations to get to a far away population. So if we're drawing a district and I were to draw a district that went from me, went around Dan, and then captured the next group, we're bypassing Dan to get to a far away person, right? That's not allowed in the redistricting. You need to get nearby populations and not go around a nearby population to get a far away population. That's how the state law is written. Next slide. So again, what I was saying, there's things that are not compact with a bunch of different mathematical formulas and other things, but our compactness definition is really kind of simple. Next slide. Here's some examples of things that aren't compact. This is actually on the left, City of Martinez. They're redistricting. See that turquoise looking district through the middle there? And all of the districts are like these long, weird shapes. That was done because 4 council members lived within like 700 feet of each other. And so they had to draw all 4 council members in the same district. Well, we came in and we redistricted this city. And the next slide. That's what it looks like now. That's compact. That's not like some crazy gerrymander to just, achieve some other outcome. That's actually districts that make sense and are compact. So under the state law, the map on the right is compact, the map on the left is not compact. Next slide. Now, we're going to look just at your district. Now, your district shape is not, your district isn't necessarily compact to begin with, but necessary. That's not the point. If we go to the next slide, we have data tables
Nobody can own the water.
And I just wanted to go over the ones. The data tables here will show your population in two different counts, and they're different numbers, and I want to explain why, because you're going to see this for a while. The data table at the top is showing your population based on the decennial census after Berkeley's statewide database has adjusted it for a reallocation of prison population. If in a house down here, there was somebody who was arrested 3 years ago, they're in prison, the California Corrections has given the statewide database the data to reallocate them back to the house where they were living before they were incarcerated, so that the population in the state is more balanced based on that. And you're not having these things where like one neighborhood in Kern County has got, you know, thousands of people and they get more political representation because of all those people, but it's depriving other areas of political representation. So that rebalancing of prison population is the one adjustment to that top data set. That is the total population of your district, which is just under 45,000. The breakdown underneath it is going to show the ethnic populations of the district, which is 11.6% Latino, 33.7% Asian, 1.3% Black, and the remainder under an other category of 53.4%, which is white, Alaskan Native, Hawaiian, and there might be some other really small populations there, but that's the primary, what other is. It's primarily white. So just over 50% white. The second data table, if you scroll a little bit more, is the citizen voting age population. When we talk about voting rights, we're talking about people who are eligible voters. So we remove non-citizens, we remove kids from that data set. And we're looking here at that citizen voting age population, which is a data that's put out by the census, is required by the Federal Department of Justice so that you can enforce Voting Rights Act cases. In that calculation, the district is 59%, that other, which is white and other categories. It is 9.8% Latino. It is 29.7% Asian and 1.5% Black. When we get the final redistricting plans and all the plans that you're considering, there's going to be columns for each district with those same population breakdowns in both of those categories. And if you go to the next slide, when you get your redistricting plans, you're going to see each individual district is going to have this kind of summary. And this summary shows the data in data tables for a little visual look. It'll show the district within the overall agency in that lower right-hand corner and have that individual district's population data in both the totals and in the citizen voting age population. So if we go to the next slide, this is where we're at, and this is following and actually exceeding the requirements of the federal voting right of the California Voting Rights Act. So we are having a pre-map hearing. We're going to have the same presentation again on June 15th. It's going to give you another chance to hear me meander in topics of compactness and contiguity. And it's also going to give the public and anybody else who wants to come a little bit more information about how they can participate. We're going to have those first two meetings and we're not going to talk about maps. We're not going to draw maps, we're going to listen, and we're going to let the public know what's going on. Then at the September 21st meeting, we're going to have draft maps. These draft maps, we will probably provide some draft maps. We generally do 3 maps, but we will also look at what the public has done if we have any publicly drawn maps. I wouldn't recommend that you as members of the school board get involved in drawing maps, but the public should be involved in doing that. If there are things that you want to see in the maps, if you say, hey, there's this real important community of interest, I want to make sure it's protected, please tell us, put that on the record so that as draft maps are being created, we can start looking at considering that. But we also want to have the public submitting maps. There will be a tool the public can use online to draw maps. I think we're planning on having that mapping tool up before the June 15th date. That's what I think June 9th, I think, is when we're going to have that finally up. We talked with the vendor today just to make sure that's all on board after sending them a couple emails trying to get that going. That September 21st hearing on draft maps will be an important meeting because it'll be the first time that a lot of the public gets to give feedback on actual maps. And usually that spikes the interest. That October 19th meeting, we might try to do some online outreach meetings. before that October 19th meeting and in between those draft map meetings. That October 19th meeting is kind of the most important meeting. Because at that October 19th meeting, you're going to take the maps that you've seen and you're going to select one to go forward to the November final meeting. That selection of a map is going to allow for your staff to put on the website, this is the map we're considering, and have the public give any feedback. If you put that map up and come to that November meeting and feel good about it and adopt it, then you're done. If you come back and you say, wow, we heard from the public, or, you know, I have this new idea, we want to change that map, great. Change the map, but then we have to schedule another meeting, make sure that map's been public for 7 days, and then you can adopt that map. There's not going to be any possibility for anybody to adopt a map that hasn't been public for 7 days. So just a real quick summary, 2 pre-meetings just like this, 1 meeting where you get first introduction of maps, another meeting where you get to call those maps down and select a map that you're going to adopt, then finally 1 hearing to adopt a map that's been public for 7 days. And that's the process. And we hope that it allows the public to be engaged. We hope that it has a lot of transparency. And we hope that through this process, you'll get maps that, you know, the community can really feel reflects the district. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Ms. Ellinger, are there any requests for public comment on this topic?
No, there are not.
So seeing as there are none, we will close the hearing. This public hearing at 6:22 p.m. And then I will open it up to board discussion. Take it away.
So thank you very much for this. It's an enlightening first time going through this, and I appreciate you giving the slide deck in advance. Just one question about like communities of interest, and I kind of understand there's like 3 criteria, because going into this, I did feel maybe how I do agree could be subjective and open, right? So the data you shared was, so my question is this, the data you shared was mostly some race population. How do you, I can see how that could be drawn from the census data. How do you get other communities of interest specifically? I guess another large one is around religion. Jewish communities, for example, who could very well be, you know, naturally living near temples or places of worship, but not necessarily, right? So how do you factor in, where are your input sources to help you, you know, get more clarity around, like you said, identifiable communities of interest outside of race and, you know, the geographical. I can see geographical being a little bit more easy to spot.
Yeah.
Physical boundaries than like a Jewish community or another religious community.
So there are a number of ways to do this, and it is one of the more fun parts of redistricting, because you really do get to learn more about communities. And first off, we like to hear about the communities of interest from the public. You are members of the public too, so you can bring up communities of interest that are important to you. But the idea is to get folks to talk about the communities of interest they think are important for this redistricting. There will be on the online mapping tool an ability to not just draw maps, but also draw communities of interest. So you can, in the mapping tool, go in and say, I want to make selection of areas, and I'm going to draw the Armenian church and the Armenian markets and where I think the Armenian community is. And you can draw that and have that be submitted as testimony as to where you believe the community of interest is. Then we can also look at data. So as an example, for the Armenian community or the Jewish community, you can use surnames to identify populations. It's not perfect, but it is one of the tools that's been acceptable and been used in redistricting. So when I was doing redistricting for City of LA or City of New York, having the Jewish community mapped with a heat map to show where they are based on surnames, and then also showing, you know, temples or other kind of, you know, whether it was like with the Muslim community, the Armenian community, the Jewish community, the Chaldean community, showing kind of those places that they might gather like a community center, those can be used to help define a community of interest. And so it's a combination of public members coming in and kind of saying, well, this is where the area is. Community-based organizations. So like with Koreatown in LA, there were 3 different maps for Koreatown in LA. There was the city's map of what Koreatown was. There was the Koreatown Neighborhood Association. Then there was the Korean American Association drew their own separate map based on how they believe that the areas changed. So, you know, working with all those kind of data sets to try to identify that. Then there's other things sometimes that you can find in the census. So if you said, well, as an example, we did a redistricting in San Bernardino County where they wanted to look at educational rates, like educational completion rates. And it was for a community college redistricting, but we took from the census and mapped different educational attainment rates. You can map commuter areas by looking in the census at average drive times. So there are data sets where if somebody comes from the public and says, my concern is seniors, we could actually map where what the median age is or where the most seniors are, and then provide that as a way for people to start to think about that community of interest. And it is one of the challenges in redistricting is there are so many potential communities of interest that we could have millions of different. I've mapped almond growers versus walnut growers in a redistricting. You know, we've done all kinds of different communities of interest, people living near airports, people living near freeways, you know, renters, homeowners, all that stuff, student populations, all kinds of things. So the point of it would be that you listen to the community coming forward with their concerns about their community of interest, and then you try to figure out what data you can use to map it.
Do you feel that, I know you're just in the data collection standpoint, but do you feel that, do you have any early assessments of if Belmont is unique? I mean, it sounds like you've done work with other districts. So do you think Belmont characteristics seem to be unique either geographically or?
Well, it is unique in that.
Maybe there's some challenges. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, even in your name, you recognize that you have some Belmont and some Redwood, right?
Mm.
And so like you do have 2 cities.
Mhm.
That's unique. You do as a geographic area have more urban downtowny, more hillsidey
Mhm.
kind of elements. You have areas where the homes are really densely populated and homes where they're more spread out. You have transportation corridors. Those are the kind of things that you might end up relying upon. You know, if we're drawing a district line and it's just another, 100 people to go over and capture that freeway, then you might just want to use the freeway. It helps the district be easily identifiable. It might not be a community of interest per se, but it is a way to draw a line that relies upon existing structure. And also the people that live on one side of the freeway, it's a little harder for them to get to the other side of the freeway. So it becomes a compactness thing too. So all that stuff gets balanced. But yeah, those are the things that jump out, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In one of your slides on numbers, voting rights, section 2.
Yeah.
I want to believe you were just giving that to us as information about what the Voting Rights Act is. But as I also listen to you talking about districting here, is the goal to create communities of interest based on minority groups and their voting rate?
Yeah.
Are you?
It's an important question.
5 of those.
Yeah. So there is this real challenge in redistricting where you can't draw districts that discriminate. Right. But then if we had all the state's preeminent Voting Rights Act attorneys in the room, they'd also tell you can't draw districts based on race.
Right.
It is this weird thing where we want to be cognizant of the impacts of potential districts on minority populations and ethnic populations. And if there is a potential majority minority district, that should get probably special consideration to make sure that we wouldn't do something purposefully to deteriorate that or to dilute that, right? At the same time, if you said, hey, Paul, let's say we're in a different area, and you say, hey, Paul, I want one more Latino district. That's not legal to do. You
Mhm.
can't do that.
Mhm.
One of the best examples I heard, one of the best metaphors I heard in this was from a guy, Justin Levitt, who works in the White House now doing Voting Rights Act work. And he said, think of the ethnic data here
Right.
like a speedometer. Now, if you drove and never looked at your speedometer, you'd speed. I mean, trust me, driving here, I know that. So you'd break the law if you don't look at your speedometer. But if all you did was stare at your speedometer when you're driving, you would crash. Right? So speedometer is something that you have this cognizant, you're cognizant of it, you check it, you make sure you're not speeding or not what, but you're not like overly focused on it. So when we do this, we'll have all the data tables for the ethnic population. And if there is a potential to create a district that's a majority minority district, we'll probably put a little note on that and probably say these 3 plans have a majority minority district, these 2 plans don't. But then at the end of the day, we not want to make sure that we're not drawing districts where we're just trying to like inch up the ethnic populations to the detriment of communities of interest or compactness or anything else. So we want to be cognizant, but we don't want to be, overly focused on it.
My other question, looking at the dates for the meeting, just like literally on the last slide, is this now officially for the 2024?
Yeah, so this would be in place for 2024.
I should take a moment to emphasize two key points that I keep reiterating. One is this process does not change the schools in which our kiddos attend.
Mhm.
It doesn't change attendance boundaries. It doesn't change our enrollment format. And 2, it doesn't, all board trustees continue to serve their term throughout. It doesn't change things midterm. Once a trustee's term is over or is out, then we decide which districts have the vote that year.
Yeah. So we'll get through this when we do the actual districts and have maps. We're going to have recommended numbering and election dates. The way to think about it is that you're redistricting. People think you redistrict in BAMO, you're in new districts. You're not. What's going to happen is you're going to redistrict. And in 2024, you're going to have 2 or 3 districts, depending on what you choose, come up for re-election. And from 2024 to 2026, you're going to have 2 or 3 board members that are elected by district, and the other 2 or 3 are going to still be representing the at-large districts that they were first elected in. Then in 2026, the other seats get elected, and now the whole board is in a districted system. Think about it as when you were elected in the at-large system, nothing we do administratively can go back and undo those votes. You serve the entire 4 years in that elected system, in that at-large system, and then the conversion to the new districts takes effect over 2 election cycles.
Is maybe too granular. Does this board decide which districts get the vote? So if in 2 years, if however they're drawn,
Yeah,
there's 3 unrepresented districts and 2 seats open. Which district gets the
So-
votes?
but just tell me, how many people are up for re-election in 24? 2, and then 3 in 26? So that's what's going to happen in this plan.
But if theoretically we all live close together, which maybe it's not the
Yeah,
case.
yeah.
In the way it's drawn, there's 3 unrepresented or 4. How does that?
So what would happen is in 2024, you're going to have a map and you're going to say these 2 seats are up in 2024 and these 3 seats are up in 2026. Now we're going to draw the maps based on all these principles and draw them the right way. When you're actually looking at the final map, you know what districts you live in. You might know which districts other people live in. You might choose that like, hey, it makes more sense for that district that I live in to be up when I'm coming out of office. So, you associate the districts based on 24 and 26. We might not be able to do anything about 2 or 3 board members being in the same district at the end of the day. And then you have to make a decision about whether it comes up in 24 and 26. And it might come down to the fact that like, hey, I'm up in 24, you're up in 26. We don't know what to do. You know what City of San Mateo did? They flipped a coin.
Yeah.
They flipped a coin on assigning the last district because they couldn't decide.
When you say you have to decide, you say we have to decide.
You have to decide, yeah.
And I will share our current board has 5 trustees from Belmont. We don't have any trustees from Redwood City. So depending on how districts are drawn.
Yeah.
It's likely that we'll replace the Redwood City site first.
Done with my questions. Formalities, thank you. And
Hey, questions are great. I love them.
I have a question, and again, thank you very much for this very thorough presentation. I was just looking at slide 10 especially. So the redistricting criteria. And I wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit more to that these criteria are ranked.
Oh, yeah. Perfect.
So like we talked about the communities of interest, and you've talked about following natural or man-made boundaries, but maybe if you could again talk a little bit about how the things that are higher up in the list get higher importance.
It's really important to understand this. You have rank criteria, but there's two ways to think about it. One is these are not perfectly ranked. It's not like we start by drawing the absolute best equal sized districts, then we go to the next step. Okay. We draw districts that are relatively equal size, and we go to the next step. We draw, make sure they're contiguous. We go to the next step. We have these things and they're ranked. Notice the last one is compact. So the first thing is these aren't perfectly ranked. These aren't perfectly ranked like that they supersede each other. And also that last criteria, if you as a board are voting on the final plan and you say, oh, I'm going to vote on Plan C only because it's the most compact and that's the only thing I care about. And I vote and the whole board votes. That could theoretically be a violation of the California of the State's Fair Maps Act, because you're saying that last criteria of compactness is more important than all the others. So when you articulate why you're adopting a plan, it's really good to just treat, the equally sized and contiguous are just going to be check boxes, right? It's really going to be important you talk about why you support a map because of that next criteria, the communities of interest. And it's going to be really important that you understand that the compactness and how the map might look is less important than those other criteria. And if you have questions through the process, we can talk about it. But they are ranked. And if, as an example, you said at the very end, oh, we want to add a new criteria. Cool. We want to add a criteria. We've had this where no district has more than one school in it, let's say, or every district has a facility in it or something like that. We've had those kind of criteria discussed, and you could add that as one additional criteria, but you can't supersede any of these criteria. You can't say, we're going to create this new criteria, but then we're going to bump it up here ahead of community of interest. And that's technically why you can't draw districts to preserve incumbency. Because in community of interest language, it says that incumbents are not a community of interest. Candidates incumbents are not a community of interest. So even if you said, we want to add the last criteria, we want to add a new criteria that all the incumbents are protected, great. But you can't supersede that other community of interest thing. So any community of interest in the area would supersede preserving the district for the incumbent. So, it's kind of a backwards way of getting there, but that's why the current interpretation of the Fair Maps Act is you can't draw districts just to protect incumbents because of the ranking.
Thank you.
They're not a community, they're not a community of interest, but the constituents can be.
So this is
Yeah, I will clarify, no incumbent or candidate or individual can be a community of interest.
Yeah, so presumably by the end of 2023, we'll have our maps drawn, we'll have 5 equal size relatively areas. And of course, we have to live with that for the next 8 years. So it's very important we get this done right and make sure, the right areas represented and it's good for the long-term future. So with that, it's important to get all the community feedback and find out we have our ideas of communities of interest, but we want to make sure that everyone is involved in that process and we get the information. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what the outreach plan is. If we have a plan in place, some timelines, some dates, what type of surveys we do, announcements, and maybe there's, I know most of that would fall on the district to do and not you, Mr. Mitchell, but.
Sure.
Dan, would you-
Yeah. So we did hit the ground running pretty strong with outreach. We put notices and correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Ellinger. We have a notice coming up in the pilot for the June meeting. We did a press release that was sent to Daily Journal. I'm not sure if it made it in there or not. We did run our public hearing notice in those venues. We will continue to promote these sessions to the greatest extent practical. When I was speaking with Paul, we talked about once we've released the redistrictor piece, the map drawing software, that there's probably an opportunity for us to host a Zoom meeting that allows us to demonstrate how to use that. We can video that and push that out as well. And then I would invite us to think about as a board, maybe naming a couple of board members, a non-majority, to work closely with me in doing that piece.
Yeah, I think one of the critical things is we want to make sure everyone's aware that it's happening, which I think the word is going out, but then we don't want to get in December and people say, hey, wait, this doesn't work out for me. And, we want to make sure that everyone's fully aware and
I did send an email to both of our city council folks to give them that heads up as well.
Unfortunately, since the city of Belmont just went through this last year, and Redwood City went 3 or 4 years ago, I think.
And last year, they redistricted last year.
Oh, yeah, because the
Version like this.
right.
We district, if I get it right, we districted, they redistricted.
Yeah, they redistricted, yeah, we conducted both Belmont and Redwood Cities processes.
So I think the residents of Belmont probably are aware of this process. A lot of them are and familiar with it. I was able to talk to some of the city council, Belmont City Council members and get their feedback. And yeah, they recommended making sure we get the community feedback. But they said the community was generally accepting of the process and was aware of the folks that did get involved. There was not a lot of conflict. I mean, people gave their input and things went relatively smoothly. And your firm represented the city of Belmont in this process as well. Okay, so you probably have a lot of that data. But as to your idea, Dan, of having board members, Mr. Mitchell, I know you are the data expert. You can pull data from everywhere. I know you do this, that's your life. So I know that you have all this data, but data can only show so much stuff. You really have to live here for many, many years to understand. It's like, oh, that's that neighborhood. So yeah, as much information as we can give you would be great. And Superintendent Gara, I'd like to see 2 of the members, as we go through the summer, as you have questions or anything, make sure that we can be a resource to provide you any nuances that data is not going to perform or present to you.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. Apologies.
So quiet.
Okay, thank you. So I want to thank the board for their comments. That what I learned is that there's an interest in transparency. I learned there's an interest in making sure that the public and ourselves understand the process and that there is equitable representation on the board throughout the district. The 2 questions I have for you, Paul, is that what happens if a district doesn't fill a seat? Is there standard language around or processes around appointments that have been well accepted? And other question is related to the Davis map. Make me think of the communities of interest. Knowing that area very well, what I noticed is that there are 2 districts on the map that have a.
Can we see the map?
It's on number 50 that have quite a few itinerants. Would it be expected to have quite a few itinerant residents, meaning folks that are there for maybe 4 years, and then another district that has been one where the socioeconomic status is quite high. So are those factors things that we factor in when we're thinking about how we draw a district?
Yeah, I think the more important, and you were talking about the more higher income parts of the city and this Davis redistricting. I think the more important part was that lower income, that one district along the other side of the freeway, the other side of the railroad tracks. That South Davis hadn't elected a council member in decades, and there had not been a council member who'd been a renter before. And that's where most of the renter population is. So in that redistricting, we did look at student population. Unfortunately, in the redistricting, the student population was really affected by the census data being really bad around universities.
Yep.
But we did look at that. We obviously looked at the downtown core in that yellow district. We looked at the South Davis with the renters this was when we first converted it. And then the rest of it kind of came down to population equality. You know, where you do have little squiggly lines, there were some weird census block shapes that we had to deal with. But trying to draw those districts to be equally shaped. So yeah, those are the kind of things that you can consider. If you have unhoused population larger in some part of the area, if you have areas with more kids, you know, and state law basically says identify communities of interest and place them in individual districts to maximize their voting and representative power. That's a lot. What that means is if you can identify something, you want to place it in a district so that its voice is louder both at these meetings and also in the elections. What you're not allowed to do in the state law, which some people have tried to do in the past, is say, hey, there's this unhoused population. We want all the city council members to care about it. So we're going to split it into 5 pieces. And what that really does is it ensures none of the city council members care about it because it becomes kind of too small in their district to really have an impact. So you've seen things throughout the state and country where like you have a city and the downtown area and everybody splits the downtown area and you wonder why the downtown doesn't get the resources. It's because their political bases are out here on the perimeters and the downtown area is split up. So identify the communities of interest and don't split them up so that everybody gets a piece. Keep them compact and preserve them within one district so that those areas have more voting power and representative power.
I have one more.
Yeah.
Can you just, a process around appointments at the.
Yeah, so that is state law. And it's different by agencies. I try not to, I'm not an expert in that as much, but generally it's an appointment process, I think. Do you?
I believe that is the case. We'll make sure we consult with CSBA on that.
Jackie, you have one more question.
Just, you said, whatever we decide, we're stuck with for 8 years. I'm still sitting with that. Is it possible that redistricting just unearths the need to redistrict? Like you create groups you thought, and you realize it becomes block voting or communities of interest that are either being overrepresented or underrepresented. And then are you actually still stuck with it? Then if it becomes a Voting Rights Act violation, or can you pivot?
Yeah, so generally mid-decade redistrictings are frowned upon. They're not allowed for cities and counties under the Fair Maps Act. If and when there's a state law that would extend the Fair Maps Act to school districts, that you have to follow all the Fair Maps Act requirements, both in your CVRA conversions and redistricting. If the Fair Maps Act does get extended to school districts, you wouldn't be allowed to do a mid-decade redistricting. Generally what you draw, you're left with for the remainder of the decade. So until 2032.
I want to thank the board for that robust discussion. Thank you so much, Paul, for your information. We'll look forward to your future presentations and our outreach and all those.